So what I'm hoping to do is make a kind of video segment about rent. Um, and so if you're okay with this ending up in that,
Yeah, of course.
okay, cool. Yeah. And if not, obviously I wouldn't do it
No,
in
go ahead.
this situation, but I appreciate
No,
that.
it's important that people are talking about this kind of stuff.
I think so too. It's kind of a hot topic.
Yeah.
Um, so if we could maybe just like introduce ourselves to each other
Yeah,
quickly.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, and just what your involvement in rent is and like what kind of what you know about it, I guess.
Sure. Okay. So my name is Calvin Beaulier. I work in the real estate industry, um, both here in New Hampshire, and then I also do some work for my mother's real estate brokerage in the Houston, Texas area. So I
Mhm.
have experience down there, and I have experience up here in real estate in northern New Hampshire. I'm currently an independent broker, but before that, when I was a salesperson, my license was held by someone who ran a property management company in Manchester that managed about, I think they're currently at about around 500 rental units.
Mhm.
So definitely, I've had all kinds of experience all over the real estate industry. I'm also an alternate on the Littleton Planning Board.
Oh, okay. That's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. So I'm definitely real estate's passion. Definitely, I everybody needs somewhere to live. It's a good business. Everyone needs to eat. Everyone needs somewhere to live.
Yeah.
So real estate's a good business because you're helping provide that need.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so just to introduce myself as well, I'm Emma. I moved up here uh last winter.
Hmm.
And I was lucky enough that my parents have a like a house up here, kind of summer home that I can like stay at. Um, but since being up here, I've realized that like rent is like really like pretty expensive.
Yeah, rent sucks. It's too damn high.
Yeah, and then like I've seen friends like leave apartments and then those apartments will go up like $100 in rent
Oh
um
yeah.
for the next person. So I'm really interested in rent because I'm really interested in living and how people live in communities, and I think that's super important for people to have good
Yeah.
spaces not only to like exist and have stability but also to like have community and like um that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so I recently talked to someone from the North Country Council
Hmm.
who gave me a rundown of the kind of trends that they're seeing both in like Grafton County and also statewide, the kind of like increasing amount of uh, cost of rent and how there's not like enough apartments being built and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, and so I was hoping that we could kind of like expand on that and I could figure out like what information you have, like maybe specifically about like Littleton and about why it's even possible for rent to like increase like this much. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
but also anything that you would want to touch on as well, like, go for
Sure. And actually, before I get started, I'm actually going to, over in the chat box,
it.
I'm actually going to send you a link to a couple articles to check out that kind of touch on this subject.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
And um, I'm going to send you, so those first two are about New Hampshire specifically. And
Okay.
then I'm going to send two other ones that are about something that is related to it. One of them addresses Airbnbs and
Oh,
how
yeah.
Airbnbs relate to rental availability. And
Great.
then the other one is actually relating to a city that I think is very successful with dealing with their housing issues, and that's Tokyo, Japan, interestingly enough.
Nice.
So, yeah, definitely take a look at those and read them over at your leisure.
I will for sure. Thank you for
So,
that.
yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would pretty much start with, and let me silence my phone here. Hold on. I'm also at home, so I have like, the dog and the kids. And so
Okay.
hopefully we won't have too many interruptions here, but let's see what
Awesome.
we got. All right. So, all right. So yes, just to generally start. Yeah. So the issue I think they were right to hone in is that there's just not enough available. There's not enough, and it's not just rentals because rentals are a subset of housing.
Mhm,
There's not enough housing available, both to rent or to purchase. Both of those, there's a shortage. So let's see. I guess so. Talking about specifically rent, why is the rent so high? It's an economic issue. It's a factor of supply and demand. And what
mhm,
do we have going on in New Hampshire? Well, for quite a while, we've had a dwindling supply, or maybe if not dwindling, a supply of housing that's maintained itself relatively flat. And this is across the entire state, not just the North Country, but New Hampshire as a whole. Our housing supply hasn't increased very much.
mhm.
Um,
So
what
people
are
just
what are
aren't like building houses and apartments and stuff like that.
people are not building? They're not building enough houses, and they're really, really, really not building enough apartments or condos. So
Mhm,
the higher density housing, especially, there's an extreme shortage of, and it's due to decades of policy decisions which may not, have been the best long-term goal if your goal is in fact to have affordable places for people to live. At the same time, the other part of the equation is demand.
mhm,
Demand has been increasing steadily. New Hampshire is a very attractive place to live and to work. It has amazing natural beauty.
mhm,
If you live in New England, a lot of people, they commute to Boston. There's a lot of people on the seacoast. There's a lot of companies that have relocated here, that are expanding here. New Hampshire has a very friendly business environment. It has a very good regulatory environment to allow the creation of new businesses. So the trend has been
mhm,
across New England, as some other parts of New England have maybe been economically struggling, like Maine and Vermont. New Hampshire kind of stands out in that it's been actually, building and growing its business
mhm.
environment. And this is, when you have a growing business environment, one of the things you need is you need workers. You
Yeah.
need skilled workers, and those skilled workers are picking up and relocating to New Hampshire. So you've had a lot of people coming into the state because of the opportunities available in the state, and they all need somewhere to live. Um, at the same time, certain other parts of the labor pool, just generally the labor pool is short. So you have all these people, businesses, and they're all chasing after a certain set number of jobs. Now, unemployment is kind of thrown off with COVID and the whole pandemic. But before the pandemic, New Hampshire had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. It was less than, I believe, it was 2% or less, which is showing that businesses really, really, really were struggling to find employees. And one
Mhm,
of the businesses that was particularly struggling was construction. And we're still seeing this. I mean, try calling the, electrician on Main Street in Littleton. They used to tell you it'll take months to get to you. Now they say we do not accept new clients because demand is so high. Same
wow.
thing with plumbing, all the trades, construction, handyman, all of this. There's a critical shortage. um, and then circling back also, so you have in, increased demand, and the pandemic only accelerated that because a lot of people wanted to get out of urban areas because the pandemic took away all of the benefits of living in a city. And really, now because we're doing this over Zoom, people can work in remotely. And that's, a lot more businesses have embraced that. They're saying, you know what, actually, when all this is over, you don't have to, you don't have to come into work every day. You can work remotely. You can live up in the foothills of New Hampshire, up in the mountains, and still work for a company based in Boston. You don't need to get
Mhm,
on the T every day anymore. So a lot of people, they're looking for what had a lower cost of living. And even though New Hampshire does have a relatively high cost of living, it's definitely a lot lower than, being in Boston.
right.
So a lot of people, they were coming up to southern New Hampshire. People in southern New Hampshire, they were maybe going up a little further into the Lakes region or the North Country.
Mhm,
So this is really, a lot of people who were on the fence about moving to, further out to more maybe rural areas. This has definitely, given them a huge nudge, to move further up. Um, and just kind of circling it back to, the supply issue. So in addition to a shortage of skilled labor that you would need to build new housing, um, the actual, in order to build housing, not only do you need labor, you also need land and you also need materials.
Right.
And those are also an issue, particularly materials. So it seems kind of ironic that New Hampshire, a state which actually does have its own timber and forestry industry, um, we actually don't have affordable enough, lumber. Lumber costs were trending up. And then this year, we actually had the price of lumber in August triple. If you're trying to build a new house and you need to, most of houses today, the way they're constructed, the materials that are used are softwood lumber. Um, and your prices triple randomly for a month, it's
Mhm.
really hard to economically plan for that. So if you are going to build anything, you're going to build something which is not very risky. And that's probably going to be custom built, you know, luxury housing, because that's the type of people who can afford to hire a custom builder. And they're going to be, these big sprawling houses, that are on acreage. And, the contract's already set, the price is already agreed, and there's not as much risk for the builder. If you're going in and building affordable housing and your input costs for your most needed material, lumber tripled, I mean, it could kill the project. It could, it would put the whole thing underwater.
Mhm.
So that's not a good position to be in. And it's somewhat unnecessary because we're right next door to Canada. And Canada actually has a lot of softwood lumber. And
Mhm.
due to political reasons, bringing it into the United States, there is, there's a limitation there. So the federal government has made it about 20% more expensive to bring in Canadian lumber than it really should be.
Oh, okay.
And all of this is, to benefit very, very narrow group of, industry interests.
Mm.
So it's just, it's just there's so many factors which have led us to this point. um but let's now dig into the land one. So one of the problems we have in New Hampshire is that everyone loves New Hampshire for being, they love the nature, they love the outdoors, they love, they like that sort of rural character that it has.
Mhm.
Well, this has created some and this that led to some policy decisions which have had some unintended consequences. So back in the late 60s, early 70s, you had a huge push throughout New Hampshire for all of these towns to adopt planning boards and zoning ordinances. And a
Mhm.
lot of these zoning ordinances, their idea was, well, we don't want everything to get all built up. We don't want, we don't want to allow, let's say, a big condo developer to come in here and build all these massive condos and change the character of our town.
Right.
So let's restrict what type of construction will allow. And let's say, okay, well, we want a rural character, so a home should have, an acre, 2 acres. If if it's in a rural area, you need 2 acres of land. You need 200 foot of road frontage. You need 300 foot of road frontage. I mean, every town has their own rules, but broadly across the state, even in southern New Hampshire, we see this again and again and again, to
Mhm.
where these zoning ordinances effectively only allow people to build single family homes on um on acreage, and that's it. If you want to come in and say, well, I want to build a couple little cottages or blah blah blah, it's like, oh, no, you can't do that, that's not allowed. Well, I want to come in and I want to build up and I want to have like 2-story apartments, like, oh, no, that's not allowed.
Mhm.
So the state has artificially limited, through this policy, and all these towns adopting these rules. They're saying, oh, well, we need apartments, but not in my town.
Mhm.
Put that in Manchester, put that in Concord. Well, what
Right.
have they done in Manchester? Last time I went down there, you don't see any condos. You don't really see
Mhm.
hardly any high rise, anything at all. And the reason is because Manchester has its own zoning. And for the majority of the city, although multifamily is allowed, it maxes out at about, 4 units or so.
Mhm.
So you have all of these areas that are in urban areas of Manchester. They could say, you know what? You can build high rise condos here. It's totally fine.
Mhm.
No, not allowed. Manchester won't allow it. So where are those people? What's happening is the sprawl is getting pushed out. And those people that would have, let's say they only wanted a small apartment, but they couldn't get it in Manchester. Well, they're getting pushed further out to Goffstown. Oh, well, there's not affordable housing in Goffstown. Then they get pushed out to Ware. Oh, there's not any affordable housing in Ware anymore. Now they're getting pushed out to Henniker and Bradford. You see,
Mhm.
it all cascades.
Right.
So
Well,
that's
and
one
I'm
of the
I'm seeing that to a certain extent here in Littleton, where there's people I know who are looking for new apartments and they can't.
there's not any.
There's not any,
When's the
so they
last time
have
they
to
built new
move to come
apartments?
over.
A lot, and there's a lot of great, and here's the thing about Littleton.
Mhm.
Littleton does more than its fair share of affordable housing in the North Country. If you're looking to rent an apartment, Littleton has by far the most options. Other communities have
Mhm.
pushed that obligation off onto Littleton. And, I think we've really risen to it as best we could. One of the things also you have in Littleton is our wonderful, walkable Main Street, and that is all mixed use. And what's really nice about that is a lot of these towns in New Hampshire, they prohibit mixed use development. So if you wanted
Mhm.
to come in and build a business in a commercial area, and let's say on the bottom floor have a commercial business, but then have apartments above that, in a lot of places in the state, that would not be allowed.
Mhm.
It is, I believe, currently allowed in Littleton. But when Littleton was built, when a lot of the stuff on Main Street was built, that was before there was any of this zoning ordinance stuff. That was predated that. And that's the default. That's how people wanted to live and build in a city. So even
Mhm.
though it's a smaller community, you do have all this mixed use in the Main Street area. And what has that led to? That's led to a very vibrant downtown. That's led to a lot of flexibility. That's led to the river district and walkability, and the
Mhm.
town's doubling down on that. And I'm on the planning board. We're about to release a new master plan,
Yeah.
and it continues with that theme, but
So the
it doesn't
getting
go
rid of
far
mixed
enough.
use,
What's that?
getting like rid of mixed use.
No, no, not getting rid of mixed use. Littleton allows mixed use, and it's going to encourage
Mixed use.
more mixed use. But
Okay.
other parts of New Hampshire and other towns aren't. They
Mhm.
aren't doing the mixed use. They don't want commercial. They don't want apartments. They don't want any of this.
Right.
So
So
that's causing a problem.
is Littleton have just more apartments that are being like built and stuff like Lahoots type apartments? Like where is that coming from?
So yeah, the Lahoots, they definitely do a lot of property management stuff like that. Some of that predated some of the zoning ordinance stuff. Some of it was Littleton, and I think you can see this. Littleton has an industrial park. Very few towns in New Hampshire allow any kind of appreciable industry or an industrial park.
Mhm.
So Littleton was very proactive in saying, we want this to be a business forward community. We have businesses in town. They're going to need worker housing, and all of this, predated a lot of the issues that other communities had is because way back in the past, Littleton either had these things or they created an environment to allow them to exist. Now, it's my own personal opinion that Littleton can do more. I think there's more opportunities in the River District, where we could have denser types of housing, maybe townhomes. I think there is an opportunity where there can be some more, some new mixed use construction. It would be really awesome to see the Hitchner property, see that converted, the way a lot of other mill buildings have been converted in other parts of the
Mhm.
state. So there's still some opportunities in Littleton, but let's look at the surrounding area more broadly. There's something called an idea called cluster development, where instead of saying, okay, every single parcel in town, if you're going to build new housing, it has to be on an acre, and it has to have so much frontage and all this and that. Instead saying, okay, we're going to put in the infrastructure, for water and for sewer, to build like a little cluster, a little, let's say there's going to be a little community, and there's going to be 10 houses or 20 houses, all within a more compact area, but let's say all of those are grouped together on one spot of the property, and then let's say the remainder is held back for conservation, or maybe it's wetlands, or maybe it's watershed, or something like that. That's another way of thinking about it and adding some flexibility to it. But the problem is fundamental. It's supply and demand, and we have an increase in demand, and normally the market would respond with creating more supply. Well, we have all these barriers in place preventing more supply. We have
Mm-hmm.
labor problem shortage. We have material issues that's created by federal policy and other things going on. The other thing too is with the pandemic, supply chains are disrupted. Everything's crazy. It takes longer to source, not just lumber, but windows, ordering those in advance.
Right.
And then with everyone stuck at home, a lot of people are remodeling their properties. Well, guess what? All the handymen, tradespeople, they're remodeling houses that already exist, and they're not available to go and build something new.
Mhm.
In addition, those people they're out there, buying the materials that are needed to build new stuff because they're renovating what's already existing. So
Mhm.
again, you have that problem, and then you also have the land usage regulations. And by the way, New Hampshire, although it is the live free or die state, ironically has one of the most restrictive land use policies in the United States. I think we're
Wow.
tied with, I think, like Oregon, Washington State, Hawaii. Like we're one of the most restrictive when it comes
Is
to
that is that like you kind of said before, like in order to preserve the land?
So the idea is partially to preserve the land, but I ask you, what, in for instance, in Manchester, absolutely blanket prohibiting high-rise housing from being developed, and they have city block areas where they could do it. Why not expand? Why not expand? Elm Street out in Manchester. Why not, have that kind of grow up, organically?
Mhm.
What are they preserving? Nothing. It
Right.
all has to do with, well, I don't want to live next to high density whatever. It's the NIMBYism factor.
So is it partially then almost like a kind of a class or almost gentrification issue where people don't want like these workers that there's a shortage of being like kind
Yeah,
of
they don't want to live next to them. Or in rural areas, they'll say, well, if you build a bunch of affordable housing and a bunch of, low income people move in and they have kids, now we're going to have to pay to educate them, but their value of their property is not high enough, support the tax base for the education. And it's like, it's this ongoing issue. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of people, they think that, oh, there's going to be too much traffic, or I want apartments, but I don't want apartments near me. And
mm-hmm.
you see this mentality a lot.
I see. So there's definitely a lot of intentional pushback for
Right. But if you look at
development.
other valves, other things they could do, they could say, okay, well, maybe not apartments, but let's look at townhomes. Let's build closer to the property lines. There's just not a political will to do that.
Yeah.
You could say, okay, well, everybody has their own house, but they're just, townhouses or something like that.
Mhm.
There's not too many places in the North Country where you could go and build something like that. And the places where you could go and build something like that, it's a lot more remote.
Right.
So it's
Um,
it's it's an it's a complicated. There's so many like things
so many
interacting
factors.
together to
Yeah.
create what we
One of
have now.
the questions that's kind of come up for me in learning more about this is I kind of realized that I don't really know much about property ownership and
Mhm.
like property taxes and the factors that go into how landlords can like price rent and the factors that go into them raising rent. So I was wondering if you could fill me in on any of that.
So in New Hampshire, it's very laissez-faire in terms of how rent works. They're responding to market rates, and I can tell
Mhm.
you that if you go out and look for a rental, you have places they're renting in a day, sight unseen.
Mm,
So in that kind of market, landlords are responding to, hey, I have this asset, it's valuable, I'm going to charge what the market can bear. And a lot of times if they have a good tenant, a lot of landlords, they'll actually hold off on these rental increases. They're waiting for that lease to end and a new tenant to show up before they start maybe going in at a higher price. But it's so much in demand
right.
that supply demand. And when you have a reduction in either of those things, you're going to, or when you have a reduction in supply, increase the demand, or vice versa, you're going to see these price rises. So
And
that's one
so
of the
is
things
the
that's happening is people, the landlords are responding to, this is this is, I can get more money for this. But you also got to think about too, remember that shortage of handymen I was talking about? Well, in order to get that plumber out there at 3 in the morning, when the toilet's leaking or whatever, guess what? That guy wants more money too, because there's not as many of him either. And then you look at property taxes. If demand's going up for all types of housing, when it finally does sell, if there's more buyers, less supply, prices are going up. Guess what? The property tax bill went up too. Well, the landlord now has to cover that. He has to cover an increased property tax bill.
Mhm.
So it's not so much that the landlords are just out there gouging everybody to see how much money they can get. I mean, they
Right.
have their own constraints and economic pressures that they're dealing with, but
Mhm.
it equals higher prices.
So is it that demand that increases the property tax?
So the property taxes are calculated based on what the value of the property is. So there are property tax appraisals or assessments that happen periodically, and the town will hire consultants, outside consultants, to go look at these properties, and they'll look at the market data. They'll look in, so in the real estate industry for residential sales, we use something called the MLS, the multiple listing service. And it's a database where all the newly available properties for sale are put. And then when those are sold, all that sale data is recorded in this database. So appraisers and tax assessors can use that, say, okay, well, we know comparable properties have sold for, in this neighborhood. So looking at the features of this home, we can estimate that its tax value is this, and they'll come up with a dollar amount. But
Mhm.
that's only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is where you're actually calculating what that bill is going to be. So the assessment kind of shows what your share of the town's bill is, or the tax bill is, but then you have, the town and the local school board. They're going to say, okay, here's our budget for this year. We need to spend money on all these things. Here's how much it's going to cost us.
Mhm.
And then at a lesser extent, the county level, but then also at the state level, and they'll say, look, there's all these services, that need to be provided. So here's our budget. So what you do is you take the tax base, and then you take the budget, and then you divide it out, and then you'll get your tax rate. So let's say everybody's assessment went up, but let's say spending stayed the same. Well, if everybody's assessment went up proportionally the same amount, then everyone's tax bill would stay the same and the rate would effectively fall. So
Okay.
all of those factors play into what the tax bill is going to be. So let's say, people's assessments are the same, but then the budget is less. Well, then your rates are going to fall, and people save money on their tax bill. So
Mm.
this is why, when you go to, town meeting in the spring, why people, they get really really animated about
Yeah.
what the town's spending money on, and if that money's being spent responsibly, because that affects dollar for dollar what their tax bill is going to be.
Mm.
You can calculate it out yourself if you know what your assessment is and you know what the proposed budget is. And even on when you go to vote, it'll say on all the warrant articles what the tax impact will be, so many cents per mill or whatever. Well, if you multiply that by what your assessment is, you'll know if, hey, if this gets approved and this, voters approve this, my tax bill is going to go up by X number of dollars.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's really interesting. And who are the people that um like in the town makes these decisions? Like there's a select board, right? That's and is
So
that
this, yeah, so there is a select board, and they do have, quite a bit of discretionary authority, but ultimately the finances of the town are approved by the voters, and the voters choose a select board. So New Hampshire is kind of unique in that it really, we do have this town, we have this town meeting system of government, which is pretty rare outside of New England, and it allows for a lot of direct democracy and a lot of really strong control that the local, registered, voters, a lot of control that they have over what their towns are doing and how they're spending money.
hmm, yeah, well, that's pretty cool. I think I have heard that New Hampshire has a strong town hall system
Yes.
where a lot of those have like gone away in other states.
Yes, and it's same thing for, the zoning ordinance that's approved directly by the voters.
Mhm.
Modifications to the zoning ordinance. Littleton right now, we're accepting any proposed changes to, the town zoning ordinance, and those will be voted on by the town. It's not like the mayor is the little, dictator for for his term or whatever. No, here
Mhm.
in New Hampshire, people get to decide. But I think one of the things people are really concerned with is they're worried that if they don't have stringent enough zoning, that there's going to be a NIMBY project come along and it's going to open up right in their backyard, whether it's a battery storage facility or landfill or what have you. And this really, really drives a lot of people's fear of allowing more flexibility, for what types of structures and housing exist in their community.
Mhm.
And a lot of it is,
And
copy paste. One town adopts an ordinance and every other town's like, oh yeah, let's adopt something that looks like that.
yeah.
Without really thinking, well, does this really fit with the community, or how land has been used here historically, or what are the long-term consequences of this going to be?
Mhm. And so what do you kind of think that like solutions for these problems are, or what should towns be doing and thinking about in terms of these issues?
Well, I don't think solutions can come from any one place. So it's not like, the solutions can just come from the government, or the solutions can just come from the town, or the solutions can just come from, developers or landlords, or builders. All of these groups, there's things that they can each do which will taken together make the situation better. So I think, from the government's point of view, one of the things that they've been doing, so there was a few years ago an accessory dwelling unit law passed. And what
Mm-hmm.
this law said was that, any town where there's, single family residential housing, these towns cannot prohibit someone from creating an accessory dwelling unit. So think like an in-law suite or garage apartment or something like that. The towns can't come in and stop people from doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been really great, especially like on the seacoast, allowing like, hey, you just need a studio apartment, and somebody's like, hey, I got space in my garage, I'm gonna turn the attic of my garage into an apartment. Boom, now an additional housing unit. So this was huge. And I think that, more of this kind of thinking, we should really think, it's like, okay, is it really fair to have some cities and some towns in New Hampshire shoulder more of this, affordable housing burden than other communities? And I think
Mm-hmm.
the answer is no. I don't think that, for instance, in Hanover, in Grafton County, it's extremely difficult to build additional housing. That makes no sense. There's huge demand because
Right.
of all the college kids there, and because of all those college kids, all these other additional businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So we should, at the state level, rein it in and say, I think the zoning ordinances in some of these towns, they've gone too far. They're too
Mm-hmm.
restrictive, and they're only creating luxury housing in single family developments. This is not inclusive. It's
Right.
not really addressing the needs of working class people. We need to really say, no, you need to really, really look at your policies and make sure that you're not prohibiting this kind of stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
and there's been some proposed bills that were filed in the last legislative session that would have done a little bit of this. And then they'll probably be reintroduced this session. And given now that there's a Republican control of the legislature in New Hampshire, they'll probably pass. So there's a little bit of relief on the government point of view. Another thing that could happen is this tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. Although maybe it won't be popular, than certain parts of New Hampshire, like, the people who sell timber for a living, the fact is that all over the country we need lumber, and we need lumber where we can get it. There's no reason to make it 20% more expensive, and especially if we can open up external sources of supply, we probably won't be as prone to price shocks, like, it going up to, tripling for the month of August. So that could help. Another thing we should think about is, what exactly are our building codes? Are our building codes flexible enough? Because in some places, New Hampshire's this isn't as much of a problem in New Hampshire as it is in some other places. But for instance, in California, let's say you're trying to build a structure and you want to use a new construction technique. You want to build out of concrete. You want to build out of metal. You want to build out of a shipping container. But it says, oh, but it has to have, according to the building code, because the building code, they're only thinking about stick frame wood houses. Oh,
Yeah.
well, you have to have the door framed like this and it has to be framed with wood and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, there might have been a cheaper way to do that, prefabricated, or maybe a new building technique or new building materials, but it's just not allowed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another issue. The
So
other
it
issue is getting more
stifles people
creative.
from creating like even different types of like building different types of structured houses.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, and we've seen this a little bit with the tiny house movement. So,
Right.
some parts of New Hampshire, it's like the house can't be under so many square feet. Well, why? or, oh, well, if it counts as a residence, it's got to have this and this and this. And, oh, you can build a tiny house here, but it still has to be on an acre of land.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. So allowing more flexibility for these alternative, types of housing,
Mm-hmm.
um, all of that I think could help. And a lot of people I know, they like to bash Airbnb and they say, "Oh, Airbnb, everybody's using the additional housing." Well, first of all, the working class housing is usually not the kind of stuff that people want to rent on Airbnb. Usually they're looking for lake houses and vacation houses and, condos, stuff like that.
Right.
So when it comes to that other stuff, actually some of the biggest proponents, or well, some of the biggest people who are opposing Airbnb are actually lobbyists from the big hotels,
Oh,
because,
wow.
if you go look and see who's funding the anti-Airbnb association of whatever, and,
Mm-hmm.
all this, you look and you follow the money trail. Oh, look, it's
Right.
the hotel industry. I wonder why.
Well,
Um,
do Airbnbs have a significant effect on the either like housing market or the rental market or anything like that?
I think it really depends on what the specific community is. I mean, if you are in a resort community, yeah, it will make an effect. It will have an effect. When you look at your normal, town, no, probably not. And the other thing too is that this is only an issue if you're not creating any additional housing. And if you look at the places that have really taken a really strong anti-Airbnb stance, um, it's done nothing to relieve the housing shortages. I mean,
Mm.
you look at San Francisco, New York. I mean, even look on the seacoast, Portsmouth. You can be really, really, really anti Airbnb, and guess what? You still won't have affordable housing
Mm.
because all the other pieces haven't been accounted for,
Right.
especially increasing supply. And that's kind of circling back, to that article I sent you about, what they do in Tokyo, Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Because even though, Tokyo, although Japan's their general population has been declining somewhat, population is still growing in Tokyo. But one of the things they've done is they have not seen this huge spike in housing prices.
Mm.
Um, actually, if you're going to look for, let's say, a 3-bedroom townhouse, 30-minute commute to central Tokyo, that's running about $275,000 right now.
Mm-hmm.
Compare that to Boston or New York or anywhere in California. It's just not, you know, and it's like, why is, especially with the increased density of Tokyo and even scarcer land, why are they able to do this? And one of the reasons they're able to do this is because their zoning compared to ours is actually pretty minimal, and it's a lot more flexible. So, and the types of housing. I mean, everything has to be built to earthquake standards, but they do allow flexibility in other regards, in terms of style or techniques or things like that. So
Mm.
that's actually allowed the creation of affordable housing. So it is possible here. The only problem is we just don't have the political will to do it right now.
I see.
But people are starting to get more aware of these issues, and they're more extreme in other parts of the country. I mean, New Hampshire, this is kind of like a taste of what could come if we
Mm-hmm.
don't act now to increase our housing supply and increase our
Right.
housing diversity, to not just say, hey, single family, McMansions, but instead, oh, you can have townhomes, you can have condos, you can have this. And one of the things that a lot of the older generation are starting to find, like retirees and baby boomers, they don't want to go out there with a snowblower at 7 a.m. and clear their driveway. They don't want to pay for the heating and upkeep of a 3-bedroom house when it's just two people. So
Mm.
they're looking for something like condos or something like that, or maybe like a community of like cottages. And guess what? They can't find it.
Right. Right.
So they people
Yeah.
need to really start thinking, it's like, just because they don't need a certain type of housing now doesn't mean that they might not need it in the future.
Yeah. Well, and it occurs to me like, I mean, definitely for young people, that's you're not gonna want a full house. Like I'm literally living in a house right now, and like
Yeah,
I would rather not because it's too big for me. But the other thing is like having that housing that puts you closer to communities and like
right.
especially like people who are moving in or trying to become part of the community, like to be right in the middle of that, it's a lot easier to become a part of the community and help the growth of a place when you have
Right.
access to it.
I mean, what do people love about cities? They love the walkability. What do you love about Boston? You got all these little intimate neighborhoods and all these little shops, and there's apartments above the shops, and it's all
Right.
walkable in this. Same thing in New York, same thing in San Francisco. Guess what? None of that is allowed under those cities' current zoning ordinance. I think it's estimated about 40% of the structures in Manhattan would not be allowed to be built today under the current zoning rules.
Wow.
So, all of these parts of these cities, guess what? All these old parts of town, the reason they're so cool is because it's the old part of town that people could
Mm,
build before all the rules came in and suffocated it.
right. Damn, that's crazy. I also want to ask you, in terms of, I guess like starting with Littleton, the people who are in charge, um, or have decision making power here, do you do you know if people have this issue on their mind and like what
Yes.
maybe they're thinking about it?
Yes. So this is something that actually comes up at the planning board meetings is we are aware there's a shortage of affordable housing. So, and that's something which, we have addressed. And so there's a new master plan that's coming out, from the Littleton Planning Board. And it's one of the things it's like, hey, this is one of the challenges. We need to make sure this is something, which people can do. So that includes, maybe taking a look at implementing cluster zoning. That includes something like making sure that the walkable areas of Littleton, so like the River District, and stuff like that, that continues to grow and develop into mixed use, walkable neighborhoods, things like that.
Mhm.
So those are all things under consideration.
And are people kind of open to new ideas and solutions, or is there
I think
pushback?
so. I think so up here. And I think that's one of the things that really makes Littleton a really cool place
Hmm.
is that I feel like some of the other towns in New Hampshire, they're like, nope, nope, we don't want anything to change. It's been this way since, 1930, and we're not going to change it now.
Hmm.
Littleton, I think, has always, you can see this with the industrial park. You can see this with the way that they, revitalized Main Street, revitalized the River District. They put that new, Schilling, their, brewery, all that.
Right.
Littleton was like let's find a way to make this work. Let's find a way where people can build a business, and do things in town. And let's work with people,
Hmm.
instead of working against them. I think if you want to look at, some of the other or so, for instance, one of the things on my mind is, you look at Berlin, and Berlin has a lot of other economic issues and headwinds, in its direction, but they don't have a, town meeting system of government. They have a city council and they have a mayor, and it's been the same people forever. And it's,
Yeah.
they don't want to innovate or be flexible or change anything,
Right.
and they're wondering why they're having a problem. And it's like, well, you need to break the mold a little bit. So I think there's more that we could do in Littleton. I think we've probably done more than a lot of other communities. On
Hmm.
the other end of the spectrum, you look at Hanover, very prosperous community. Um, they also have a serious issue, and they're not really looking to, as far as I know, seriously address it. Um, and that's the other end of the, socioeconomic coin there. But it's just, I think that people should be pro housing first. Yes, there are things to think about like traffic. Yes, there's things to think about like safety and can a fire truck get in here and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Yes, we need to think about conservation and not paving over every square inch of, our natural environment.
Hmm.
But I think that those things can be addressed and they can be mitigated, but we need to have a housing first kind of
Right.
mentality. And I think really the policy for decades has been a housing last mentality.
Mm.
Only if all these other things are happy and perfect can you then, okay, you can build one house here.
Mm.
And I think we need to kind of turn that on its head and say, look,
Yeah, I mean,
housing
I
is a
feel like the
critical
first,
need.
as like for humans, the kind of first thing,
Yeah.
the first essential is like, like you're saying, housing and food.
Yeah,
Right.
housing and food. And if we don't address this, like it's only going to get worse. And you can see,
Mm.
if you look at, the issues people are having with homelessness, it's so much easier for someone to slip into homelessness if your community is facing an affordable housing crisis.
Right.
You can't, if your community says, "Oh yeah, you can rent an apartment for, $700, $600, whatever, no problem." Versus you have a community where no, 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 housing's going to start like in California, you need $2,500 a month in order to get into a decent apartment. Well, it's so much easier for someone to then lose their job, have unexpected medical expenses, what have you, and then start
Right.
living out of their car.
Right.
And once you're living that kind of lifestyle, other things can happen to you which will keep you entrenched in that lifestyle, and
Yeah.
then you're going to start to have these tent cities and these other major problems.
Yeah. Well, and that's a huge frustration right now with the pandemic is I feel like it increases the risk of something really, bad happening and kind
Oh
of
yeah.
financial
Well, they
instability.
say stay safe, stay at home. Well, if you don't have a home,
Yeah, right. Yeah,
you
and
know.
you're putting not only yourself but like, the community at risk as well. And like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's frustrating that this is a problem. It like during a pandemic and also seeing like during the pandemic, you know, rent go up so much.
Yeah.
Like there feels to me definitely kind of it's a weird disconnect happening for many different reasons of like um you know wages included in that, like
Yeah.
that rent is going up. Like it seems very weird to me.
So one of the things that I think, and I can let me see if I can Google this, or I can send it over to you on Facebook Messenger. There's this chart, and it's a national thing.
Yeah.
And I think New Hampshire actually has a milder version of what's going on nationally, because some of these issues are so much worse in major cities. Um, but one of the things, it tracks inflation or the consumer price index. And it's
Mhm.
like, here's the price of like healthcare, and it's shoop. And like, here's the price of, college tuition. It's like shoop. And then it's, housing, shoop. And then it's like other things like, food's up slightly, and you look at stuff like TVs, it's down,
Mhm.
cell phones down, stuff like that. But it goes to show you that there's something fundamentally rotten in the way the market's responding to things, because there's these barriers in place. And I might be a little biased because, like I said, I grew up in the Houston area, and one of the things Houston's famous for, I mean, it's very flat. It's not an area of a lot of natural beauty if you've ever been there. But one
Mhm.
of the things it does have is it's the largest unzoned city in America. So
Mhm.
Houston has no zoning.
Okay.
It does have a version of zoning in that there's setbacks. So, for instance, if you operated something like, an auto body shop with a paint booth, you have to be so many thousands of feet away from a residence because of the noxious smells or noise or whatever.
Right.
So, to me, that kind of makes more sense, than just saying, oh, well, you can put this over here and this over here.
Yeah.
The other thing is in Houston, if you buy a house in a subdivision, there are restrictive covenants. Um, and those restrictive covenants say, hey, if you buy this land, you agree that you're going to use it as a house, and everyone else who bought in this subdivision, they're going to use their land for a house. So
Mhm.
even though there's no zoning, you're effectively saying this is a residential area, this is a subdivision with houses.
Right.
And one of the things you see is, even though, housing costs are up in Houston, um, you can still buy a starter house, in the 200,000s, in a major American city,
Sorry,
which
give me 1 second. Someone's calling me. I just gotta. Oh, I can't. Sorry, someone was just. Ah. Okay. Sorry, someone was calling me. I'll call them
no, no,
back
no,
later.
it's all right.
But
Um,
so that's the same kind of thing as like not prohibiting like multi-use
it's
kind of
same thing
thing.
as Tokyo. I'm not saying, oh, let's abolish all zoning or whatever,
Right.
but what I'm saying is that if you don't go to these extremes
Right.
that some of these coastal cities have gone to, you can still create affordable housing, because you can still
Mhm.
buy affordable housing or starter home in the 200,000s in Houston, you know,
Right.
versus, I mean, try to buy a starter house in Boston. Where are you going
Yeah.
to start at? Half a billion more? That's not, there's no reason other than there's these policies standing in the way that, create all these, knock-on effects.
Yeah, right. Well,
So
and it seems like those like with Houston and Japan, what or Tokyo, what makes sense is that these the policies that they're creating are more geared towards like health and safety. And then
right.
it's like, oh, what you want to do, what's needed, go ahead and do that as long as it's like, everyone's safe or whatever.
Right, right.
That
Versus
makes a lot more sense to me
versus
too.
I only want to look at quaint little country farmhouses when I drive out of town.
Right, exactly. Kind of superficial,
Or I
superficial.
don't want Main Street to look any different than it did when my grandfather,
Mhm.
and it's like,
Well, and
well,
it seems like those rules create a very like superficial kind
yeah,
of
it's they
look of
want everything to
growth.
look like Disneyland, and then they make anything that doesn't look like that illegal, and it's like, okay, well, that's gonna have, what has the saying go? You can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality.
Mhm.
And if you don't give people a place to live, you're going to see things like homelessness. You're going to see things like astronomically high rents and these, very, very, very unbalanced communities in terms of demographics.
Mhm. Right.
So, and it's all a
Um,
thing.
and
And the other thing too is, I mean, you could say like, oh, well, what if the government built a bunch of subsidized affordable housing, whatever? And they've tried this in California, they've
yeah.
tried this in New York. And if you look at how those properties are maintained, they're not. I mean,
Mhm.
the stereotypical New York City project, with the failing elevators and the high crime. And
Yeah.
it's like, let's just warehouse all the poor people in an undesirable part of town that's hard to get to, and that'll
Right.
somehow fix the problem. And it's like, no,
Yeah.
you've concentrated and exacerbated all these issues.
Right.
Communities should be something where people of all socioeconomic levels are all living and interacting,
Right.
and
Right.
that's the way
Well,
it
and
happened
that creates.
historically. It happens that way organically through
Mhm.
the organic growth. And then you have this very artificial top down model put on, and it doesn't work. So I think we should give communities a chance to organize and grow organically again, while
Mhm.
at the same time still respecting each other's safety, privacy, the environment.
Mhm. Right. Right. Well, and in terms of subsidized housing, I've like heard Ahead does like has done like really great stuff for the community, but at the same time, like there's not anywhere near enough housing to like
No, there's
help.
not. And everywhere with subsidized housing has waiting lists. It just does.
Right.
But again, I mean, when you have government provided housing, you have a maintenance issue, you have a quality issue, you have a concentrating social ills issue, and then it becomes a political battle. Just like people don't want a prison in their community or they don't want a landfill. Well, I don't want the social housing, and they don't want the cheap housing
Right.
or subsidized housing either. They don't want the projects. So it becomes an issue.
Right.
But mandating, saying, like for instance in New York, every project you build, you have to have so many affordable housing units.
Mhm.
That's great, but it doesn't come anywhere close to meeting the demand. And if you mandated, you have to have enough units to where you could meet the demand. Now, because of all the other regulatory hurdles you had to jump through, the project's no longer economically feasible and it doesn't get built at all.
Mm.
This is one of the problems Baltimore's having. It has all of this burned out, housing. But if you want to go buy one of these, townhouses and revitalize it, you have to check all these boxes. It's really expensive to
Oh,
do. They are estimating in New York City to build a condo, over 50% of the cost of the condo is actually just regulatory compliance.
wow.
Just that. So you've doubled the costs.
Right. That's a lot.
Yeah, in a place where humans have been living there for centuries, it's already super dense. Let
Mhm.
it be super dense. Let it be pro-human.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for chatting with me. I
Sure.
don't want to take up too much more of your time.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but yeah, I really appreciate it, and you've given me a lot of information about this issue that like some really good details and stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I mean, this is definitely something that's solvable. I think it will get solved. I mean, there's already, I think, momentum. And I think this is one of the few issues in America today that there's momentum on both sides of the political spectrum
mm,
to like fix this issue,
that's
to
good.
create more housing. And people are starting to recognize, hey, the NIMBY zoning, the snob zoning, it's getting a little out of hand.
Right.
I think doesn't matter left, right, both sides are starting to see, hey, this is an issue. This is something we need to work on
Right.
because people need a place to live. People need affordable
Well,
housing to raise
and
their
that's what
families.
I'm kind of trying to do with making this segment, at least starting to, is to both speak to people who are also thinking about the issue and to let other people know more about the issue, and
Yeah.
see like who is interested and passionate about this issue, and working on trying to like make some positive change. And if there are ways that people who just like kind of like live in Littleton or whatever could get involved, how would you say that
Well,
people?
the planning board meetings are open to the public. So definitely, sometimes, especially if there's something, maybe there's a cranky neighbor, they don't want something to get built next to them. Well, when you go to build something, you have to notify all the abutters, which are people next to the property. And usually, if people like it, they will just stay home. So you only hear the negative if there is a negative. Now, so far that I've been on the planning board, it's mostly been pretty amicable. It's still a small community where most people know their neighbors, so it's really not as much of an issue here.
Yeah.
But one of the things is, like, if you see something that you really believe in, like, oh, hey, we should do this for the river district, or oh, hey, they're, revising the, community master plan, or oh, they're taking suggestions right now for amending the zoning ordinance, is to actually show up for the meeting. I know it's a pain, it's
Mhm.
after work or whatever, and you got to go to a stuffy, building or whatever. But show up for the meeting and say, hey, I just want to say, I've been thinking about this. Write letters to the editor is another way. And the other way is just raising general awareness, just saying, like, you know, if somebody says, hey, they're building new housing over here, instead of saying, like, oh, I can't believe they're blah, blah, blah building, say, wow, that's awesome. That's great. That's great. We're having more housing built for our community. I mean, even luxury condos create affordable housing because
Mhm.
people move out of wherever they are, if they can afford the luxury condos, to move to the luxury condos. And guess what? All the places they left are now vacant. And they
Right.
could have been, older housing that
Mhm.
might be affordable. So
Right.
you're increasing the supply.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and so wait, before we sign off, are the meetings on Zoom? Are they in person? And what times do
So
they
they are
happen?
in person with social distancing right now.
Okay.
And they are on the town's website.
Okay.
So if you want to do some guerrilla documentary making, you can probably drop in on one of these. They are open to the public.
Cool.
Um, I don't know how they'd feel about recording. They'd probably let you if you're really nice,
Cool. Well,
as long as
even
you're not
just
trying to be
if
like
I could
gotcha
meet
or
other
something.
people who are talking about it and get some more information, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's definitely one way. And the other one is, if there is a bill coming up for a vote in Concord, and it is one that's pro housing,
Mhm.
sending a note to your legislator, just sending them an email. I mean, New Hampshire has a citizen legislature, just saying, hey, this bill's coming up and it's going to create more housing, and I think it's great, so you should vote for it. And that, carries a surprising amount of weight, especially because this isn't one of those hot button left versus right culture war issues.
Right.
This is something where I think if people were really informed about the consequences of some of this stuff, they would probably say, oh yeah, okay, let's let this happen.
Right.
So
Yeah. Well, definitely, I think getting involved is really important, and
yeah.
I hope if anything, this can encourage
Yeah,
more people to
there's
become involved.
actually there is I don't know if it's a political action committee or a nonprofit or something like that, but it's actually based out of the San Francisco Bay Area because they probably have the most extreme housing crisis in the country. And that's actually one of the things, even though they're generally a progressive cause, is they've actually lobbied very strongly for reducing some of the zoning requirements, which has
Mm.
historically not been a thing, but they've actually started doing that. So it's becoming kind of a I would say maybe like more blue collar, but also progressive issue out in California. So there's that organization. They're relatively new. I'll see if I can dig them up and I'll send you the link,
Cool.
because they're actually, like, they go to all the, and it's, of course, San Francisco, a major city, but they go to all the city council meetings and they're very, very, very vocal.
Right.
They even decide to endorse or not endorse candidates
Mm.
because it's become such a heated issue there, because it's so dire and extreme there compared to what we're dealing with here.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the goal kind of is to not get into that
Yeah,
situation.
exactly. Exactly. So,
Yeah.
but
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to me.
yeah, you're
Um,
welcome. Let me
and
know when you get everything all together and edited. I'd definitely be
I
curious to see it all. So send me a link.
I will for sure.
Awesome.
All
Awesome.
right. Have a good one.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.